Welcome to another video in the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. Right now, we're wrapping up our shopping cart form. In this video, we're going to update the database, the API, and the front end so you can properly calculate sales tax. Now, if you're a Patreon supporter at the $5 per month level or higher, make sure you head over to get the latest source code. Either way, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you can follow along. And finally, as you think of suggestions, please leave them down in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts on the course. Right now, we've got a number of comments that have come up that I'm gonna bundle into one video, probably the next video, that will be more of a, hey, let's fix this stuff video. And that's all from comments that you have given me. So it's really turning out great. I really appreciate your suggestions. Keep them coming. Okay, let's get started. So we have our TimCo Retail Manager solution with our 5 projects here. There are no changes yet because we have not yet changed anything. And if we went to sync, it'd be the same thing. There are no changes on the server. So let's go over here and get started. Let's start with our data first. So in our table, which right now we are calling this SP product underscore get, which gives us the product name, the description, the retail price, and the quantity in stock. But what we have here in the sales table is we have the tax amount. And remember, the sales table is the total. So this is the overall transaction. So you have the date, the subtotal, the tax, and the total for the transaction. And the sales detail page has how much tax was applied to this particular item. So we can add those up to get our total for taxes. However, we don't have anywhere in this product table that says what if this is taxable or not. And this is one of the suggestions that came up that, I'm going to do a suggestion video, but this one's a pretty big one. And that is that not everything is taxable. So there's some things that are and some things that aren't. And so what we need to do is we need to add in here the ability to say, is this a taxable item? Now, there may be cases in some countries or in some areas where some things are taxable at some rates and not at others, and those types of things. I don't think we're going to go there. I think what we're going to do is we're going to assume that our audience has, if it's taxable, it's being taxable at the same rate. So, if we have a tax rate of, let's just say 8%, then if something is taxable, it gets taxed at 8%, not 8% for this, 6% for that, and 14% for this other thing. Now, if you're following along and you say, well, I really want to have that, it's not a huge difference. What I'm going to do is have a flag here. And it's going to say, is taxable. In fact, let's just do that. Is taxable. And it's going to be a bit. And the default value will be 1. Meaning, yes, it's taxable. So by default, things are taxed. We specifically say these things are not taxed. So for you, if you wanted to tax at different rates, what you would do is set the percentage. So this would be 0% for not taxable, and then 1%, 2%, 5%, 4.5, whatever it is for the percentages. The reason I'm not going to do that is because it's not much more as far as typing goes, or as far as storage goes. The difference is that it is a lot more as far as updating something. So if the government says we're at a 6% tax rate, and then a new law passes, and of course it goes up, so now it's at 7%. Well, now you have to update every single item to 7% from 6%, but then you have to reevaluate as every product actually goes up to 7%, and it becomes a little confusing. So that's a lot more complicated, and I don't foresee us needing that for our situation. So we're just going to have an is taxable, and we'll have a one static rate, And it may even be in a settings file somewhere that this is the tax rate. It's, it's 7.75. Well, that's the tax rate. Okay, so we have that flag, and now in our product get all, we need to pass that flag through as well, like so. And now we have our is taxable going through. So that's our store procedure, which means that we also need to modify. Well, let's wait for a minute. Let's first do our publish to make sure that this publishes and make sure that it works the way we intend it to. So we'll push these changes to our local database, and that's been updated. So now we can go to SQL Server Object Explorer. We can look at our SQL Server. And what is the SQL Server name? Let's look at our publish real quick. And we call the SQL Server database TRM data. Right here. So now our table, let's go to products and look at the data. And now we see is taxable is true for all of these things. Let's set it to false for one of them, just so we have a different value. So now the large toaster ovens are not taxable. Okay, so now we have our store procedure and our table modified, or actually our table and then our store procedure modified. So those are taken care of. Now we can come over here to our data manager library and look at our models. We have our product model. And now we're going to add a Boolean for is taxable. And just like that, the API will now return is taxable. Now you see I didn't really change much. The store procedure changed what it returned. And I didn't have to add this. So when I add the column to the table, I didn't have to modify my product if I didn't want to, my store procedure product. And I just wouldn't have returned that column. And then I modified my store procedure, and that didn't break anything either. I didn't have to modify this model. Since I did, and since I'm calling that store procedure, now my API is returning is taxable as well. The front end still doesn't care about is taxable, and it won't catch the is taxable, and that's okay. So all on the way now, we have this disconnected architecture where even though we add something, it doesn't affect anything else until it asks for it. Now, if you modify the name of a column or the type or remove a column, yes, that will affect things because of the fact that they're relying on those things to be there. But adding a column, it's not a problem to add it in one spot and not the rest. Of course, if you want it all the way through, you have to pass it all the way through. So now it's in our API. We can come over to our desktop UI library, go to our model, and go to product model. And let's go ahead and capture that. Like so. And I've gotten some questions about, and I've answered them before, but I've got some questions of the fact that I am not, I'm using a copy essentially of the product model from our data manager library in the desktop UI library. And so they're the same model it looks like. And the reality is these are different models because this one is for display. It captures it from the API and goes right to display. The other one is for our backend to connect to what SQL has. And they can be different, and that's okay. And we want them to be different possibly, but even if they're the same, they're not the same thing. Even if they have the same properties, they're not the same thing. Therefore, we don't create an interface and have both of them point that direction. We don't want any coupling between the back end and the front end. So they are two separate models. All right, now that we have the is taxable in our product model, we can come to the UI and look at our view model. Actually, let's do this. Let's look at our views first and look at our sales view just to kind of get our bearing on where we're at. Right now we have a shopping cart. Once you add something to the cart, it updates a subtotal. But now we need to figure out the tax for this whole cart. And then from there, subtotal plus tax equals total. So just to refresh ourselves, let's go to the view model for the sales view model and look at the subtotal. Let's look for subtotal. So the subtotal right here, what it's doing is it's looping through into a for each for retail price times quantity. So I think what we can do is do something similar with our taxable. So we can basically copy and paste what we have here. And we'll change subtotal to be tax amount. And rename that everywhere. But instead of retail price times items quantity in cart, which we want, we also want to then multiply it by our tax amount. But the problem here is that's an additional calculation I might not always want to do. And if I multiply by 0, it's going to put 0 in, which is good. But if I do my multiplication wrong and say quantity in cart times 0, no, it's like a 0. So we're good. Okay, just trying to think through and make sure I don't introduce a bug here where I somehow get values into the tax that shouldn't be there. So let's just say times item dot product dot is taxable. Well, here's the problem. Is taxable a true or false? And we don't have a tax rate. So that's not going to work. So let's do this. Here's what I'm going to do, just because I'm going to comment this out. I'm going to come back to this, but I don't want to forget to come back to it and then have it run this calculation and be wrong. So let's go over to our helpers and see what helpers we have available to us. Just a password box helper. That's not real helpful to me yet. Besides the fact that that's a UI helper. And down here we have API helpers, but that's it. So let's create a new folder in our library, or desktop UI library. And it's going to go off a screen here, but I'm going to create a new folder. We're going to call it, let's call it something like just helpers. And inside here, I'm going to add a new item. It's going to class, and we'll call this the config helper. Now, eventually, we move to .NET Core, it becomes a little easier and a little more straightforward. But this is okay for now. Make a public class config helper. We'll make it a singleton eventually. We actually add it to our dependency injection. But for now, it's just a class, and we'll have one method in here. And what it's going to do is it's going to read configuration information. Specifically, it's going to read information from the app settings. So we'll set the rate in here. This probably won't be the place we'll keep it long term. In a .NET Core app, I might put this in a key vault, somewhere that is easily accessible and changeable, but at the same time, only through permissions. But in our case, this will work. Another option is to put in a database, but I think that's overkill for one setting. So add key equals tax rate, and the value is going to be, this is going to be a percentage. So let's just say that our tax rate is 8.75, which means 8.75%, which is actually 0.0875. So just keep that in mind when we're thinking through what that number is. So now we have the tax rate in our app config, which notice is in the UI project, but we're going to access it from the library. So the library is dependent on the UI project having an app config with this setting. So we're going to create a method that's public. It's going to return a double. So public double get tax rate. And what this will do is, we'll say double output equals 0. Not output, equals 0. There we go. And now we're going to read our value, but it's a string right now. So string rate text equals configuration manager. So using system.configuration, configuration manager dot app settings, and the app setting is going to be our tax rate. Let's make sure that's the correct one. Tax rate, and yes it is. So tax rate, and then that's really all we need to do there. So now it goes into tax rate as a string. However, we need to convert this over to a number. The question is, if we don't have a valid number, what do we do? Because if they put in their, let's just say test in that value, well, then that's not a valid tax rate. We can't calculate taxes. If we can't calculate taxes, what do we do for an application? And I think the answer is we don't. If you can't calculate taxes, you can't start doing sales. Otherwise, you have a mess. If you start giving things tax-free, then the government comes after you. You're on the hook to pay those taxes. So that's definitely not something we want to allow. So any kind of bug should shut the system down rather than allow it to continue. So the only question we have now is, do we just say output equal, output, well, if I spell it right up here, there we go. Output equals double dot parse tax, rate tax text, like so. What that'll do is it'll throw an exception that if it's not a valid number. However, that's one of our choices. The other choice is to do a try parse and then throw a more cohesive, a better message. I think that's the way to go. Because this will just say, could not parse value. Well, what does that mean? So the thing we'll do is we'll do a try parse. But then a try parse, what it wants to do is it's going to return a Boolean. So bool is valid tax rate. And we're going to have a output, like so. And what will happen is it's going to put in here, did this work or not? So if is valid tax rate, and I can leave that alone, or I can say, no, let's just do equals false, because I'm only going to capture the false here. The true will just return output. So as false, we're going to throw an exception. Otherwise, we're going to return the output because it's a valid tax rate. Therefore, this number is now correct. Now, it is telling you up here that this green, the reason why it's green, it's saying the variable declaration can be inlined. What that means is I can say double output and get rid of this line up here. So I can say double, and this line up here becomes redundant. And now I've declared it and used it all in one right here. But for our is valid tax rate equals false, I can say throw new, and let's look at our exception list. So I type exception, and we have, I believe it's, let's go invalid. There's invalid cast, operation, and program, index out of range, format exception. Let's do configuration exception. Because there's a configuration of the system that's incorrect, and that's the tax rate. So our message is the tax rate is not set up properly. Like so. And it's obsolete. Interesting. Configuration exception is obsolete. Create a new exception of system configuration. I'm not quite sure why it says the exclamation point there. That doesn't seem right. Configuration errors exception. So I'm not quite sure. Maybe that's correct. Okay. So we're saying the other one was saying do this, not this, and it was using the exclamation point to indicate that, and it was all scrunched together. I guess the reason why is because they deprecated the previous one. So now configuration errors exception is the newer exception to use. So always read your green squigglies. They mean something. So in this case, we did this. What it says here, the message actually says this is deprecated, meaning it's still in the .NET framework, but you shouldn't use it anymore. There's a newer version or a newer way of doing things. And this is in place so that old code doesn't break, but we have a newer way of doing things. And probably if I did this, I could add an obsolete tag. Okay, so the suggestion is, hey, if you're using this, then put an obsolete tag above your entire method saying this method is obsolete, and then create a new one to do the same work. We're not going to go there. We're going to, this is new code, we're going to do it the right way, which means using the configuration errors exception. Okay, so now we have a method called getTaxRate, which reads the tax rate in from the configuration manager. It tries to parse it. If it's not parsable, then it throws a configuration errors exception saying the tax rate was not set up properly. If it is a valid tax rate, then we return that tax rate as a double. So that's our one method in the config helper. Let's go ahead and do our quick actions, which is to generate an interface for this. iConfig helper is fine. So our iConfig helper. Now we can come over to our bootstrapper, which we really need to move us out of the bootstrapper and put it somewhere else. Have a configuration section just for our container. That's probably something we're going to put in the list. In fact, I'll do that right now. I've got a list of the things you suggest. I'm going to add this to my suggestion as well, which is to create a class for container configuration. So that's my list now. All right. So in here, I'm going to add another singleton. I'm going to add it after logged in user model because that's just easier than adding one that has a semicolon at the end. So dot singleton, and it's an iConfig helper, control dot to add the using statement, and then config helper like so. Well, almost. Move these to the right spot. There we go. So now I have the iConfig helper in my my bootstrapper's container, the dependency injection system. So now in my sales view model, I can request that. So I can have a iConfig helper, config helper, like so. iConfig helper, config helper. Config helper equals config helper. Do our control dot here to add the using statement. And now my sales view model has access to that config helper. And it's a singleton because we don't need to be anything more than a singleton. So now down here in my tax rate, I can uncomment this. I can start modifying this code. So double tax rate equals config helper dot get tax rate. We can wrap this right here. So surround with, so snippet, surround with if, and this is going to be if item dot product dot is taxable. Then add this amount, the retail price times the quantity in cart times the tax rate, like so. And we get this error. The error says you can't multiply a decimal and a double because they have different precision rates. So what are we going to do here? Well, this is one of those cases where even though it's a percentage and percentages are normally doubles, in this case, it makes sense to make it a decimal because otherwise we have to cast this to type decimal. So therefore, our config helper, we say decimal, and then here we say decimal, and in our iConfig helper, we say decimal. And now we have to say decimal here too. And that should be it from that side. Now we can go over to our sales view model and make this a decimal. And now everything is good. Now we have a decimal for the tax rate, and we can do our multiplication, and that should give us our taxable amount. Now, this does raise some questions. This is going to return a value, that's right here. It's going to return a value that is not just 2 decimal points, meaning it's not going to be $5.15. It's going to be $5.153286 kind of thing. So where do we do the rounding? How do we record it? So do we add all these values together and then round the final amount? That's a different value than if we do every value rounded to just 2 decimal points. That's also a different value than if we do just retail price times tax rate rounded and then multiply it by the quantity. You see the complexities that come in here? I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the raw value, the full amount, add it all together, and then I just display currency, which is just 2 decimal points. I think that's where I'm going to go. I think eventually we might look into, how do companies do it? How does the government request you do it? It may be different in different areas. So we need to be careful about that. But at the end of the day, I think that the raw amount is fine. And we can even work with that going down, moving along to say, well, we actually want to round it this way later. So I am aware of the rounding issues, but we're going to leave it alone for now. So now the tax rate should be set. And if a tax rate is set and the subtotal is set, then what we have is an interesting situation. We have a total now, which normally I would say, well, let's add the subtotal and tax together. But they're both strings. And that's not terribly ideal. But that's okay because it's not terribly ideal to have this whole calculation being done inside your property. So let's do this. Let's make this into a method on its own, a private method. I'm going to copy it, and right below it, I'm going to have a private decimal. This is going to be calculate subtotal. And it's going to return subtotal. Well, now we can just put that right into here. Calculate subtotal and return toString. We can even just do this dot toString C if you wanted to and shorten it. And I kind of like that idea, so let's do that. There we go. Return calculate subtotal dot toString like so. And now we can do the same thing with tax. So if I copy this and we do, let's do it above so I can actually move both of these at once if I want to. Private decimal calculate tax. Calculate total tax. I think it's a little more clear that we're going to calculate all the tax. No, let's just call it calculate tax because otherwise you're thinking it's a total plus a tax or something weird like that. So return tax amount. And now we can take calculate tax, put it down here, and get rid of all the rest of this. So now he has one line here, which also means we can now say decimal total equals calculate subtotal plus calculate tax. And then we're going to return total toString, returning the currency value of it. So that's the total. So now we should be able to look for anywhere we're updating calling the, hey, notify a property change on subtotal. We should also update it for the tax and the total. So let's look for the notify a property change on subtotal, which is right here. Let's just do a Control F actually to see if it's anywhere else in this current document. Remove from cart. So add to cart and remove from cart. So let's make sure we get both of those. I'll copy this and I'll paste it, and we'll say that this is the tax and this is the total. I'll copy these, come down and remove from cart, and make sure that these also are going to notify of the property change. Now let's see if this all works. I'm going to run this. Got to see if I remember my password. So login name. And I did. Okay, so remember that the large toaster oven, I believe, is not taxable. Let's just check that to be sure that's the one. Let's go to my SQL table and look at products, data, and it was a large toaster oven. So just to be clear, it's the large toaster oven that is not taxable. So if I add that to the cart, notice no tax, but there is a total. Let's add 2 fluffy bath towels. And that's way too much tax. That's an incredible amount of tax. I don't know what country we're living in, but that ain't right. And here's the reason why. We made a mistake. Obviously. Either that or we're evil dictators that really want to take a lot of money. So let's see if you can spot the mistake in my code if you haven't already. It is in our tax calculation. So that's calculate tax. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that our tax rate is 8.75, I believe. We just modified our retail price times our quantity times 8.75, and that ain't right. Because what that's saying is that it's 8 times the total amount. So if we owe $10, we owe $87.50 in taxes. But what we really owe is 8.75% of $10. Okay, there's a big difference, which means we have to move the decimal point 2 for this tax rate, which essentially is just we need to divide by 100. We could also multiply by 0.01, but divide by 100 works. Let's try that again and see if we can't get a better, more favorable amount. So let's drag over our window for our API and our WPF. We log in and we add our large toaster oven, no tax. We add our 2 fluffy bath towels, and now we have a tax of $5.24 with a subtotal of 109 and a total of 115.13. If we add 15 skillets, there's not 15 skillets in stock. How about 10 skillets? Yep. How about 11 skillets? Nope, there's only 10 skillets in stock. Let's just add 9. There we go. So now we're calculating taxes based upon our quantity in the cart and what's taxable, and multiplying all out, adding all together, and getting this value that doesn't look too bad at this point, just 8% of whatever we have in the cart. Now, it doesn't hurt to do these calculations yourself, and I just did. So what I did was I said that the toaster oven is $49.99. So I took this subtotal amount, I subtracted $49.99, I then multiplied the resulting value, by 1.0875. That's 100% plus 8.75%. That gives my total. And then I added the $49.99 back in, and that gives me an overall total, which came out to $353 and 0.021875. So that rounding down to 0.02 or 2 cents. So that is correct in our calculation. So now we have a system that properly calculates sales tax based upon if something is taxable or not. So our large toaster oven, if I have 2 more, so now I have 3 large toaster ovens, isn't change my taxes at all. If I keep adding more, taxes don't change because toaster ovens are not taxable. Now, one of the things that's been mentioned, which I do like, and we're going to modify this cart with, is the items right now. This is ugly. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make these into 2-row entries. So you're going to put a little bit of information below, things like what's the total cost for this, is it taxable, things like that below it, so that it's a little more clear what's in the cart and what it means. On the left, we'll probably have the quantity in the cart as well as is it taxable. So we're going to kind of expand these out a little bit, be a little bit more clear in how our drop downs work. Okay, but for now, that's this lesson. We've covered how to add taxes all the way through and get them into the system. Before we go, though, a couple of things to clean up. First of all, let's go ahead and go to our changes and add taxable to products. Adds the ability to tax or not individual products. Close enough. And then we'll add everything essentially. So I can select everything here, or I could have selected the highest level and just hit add. I prefer to add things manually like this for staging. That way I don't accidentally add something I shouldn't. I've staged them all. I've had my commit message. I commit the staged items. And now I go to sync. And I should do a fetch first to make sure there's nothing on the server. There's not. And then I'll push my changes up to GitHub. And now we're done. So that takes care of this lesson. For next lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to come back in here and do a lot of cleanup work. A lot of things that you suggested, little things, tweaks here and there, make some things a little better. And we had some discussion about the cart updating properly, and so we've got some things to look at there we're going to hack out. And then we're also going to hopefully wire up that button. So we have the remove from cart button, and we'll make those list items a little bit more feature rich as far as what it shows. Okay, so it's kind of a cleanup lesson next week. You'll not want to miss it, but in anticipation of that, if there's anything else you notice that you want to see changed or tweaked, or things I missed, or things I could have done better, please let me know. And I'll try and get that on the list for changes to do for next time. Okay? Thanks for watching. As always, I am Tim Corey.